What would it take for you to become a monster? Not a fictional villain, not a psychopath, just you. In 2003, deep inside the walls of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, something horrifying happened. American soldiers, young, ordinary, unremarkable, committed acts so brutal, so dehumanizing, that the world recoiled in disbelief. They humiliated, they tortured, they destroyed. But this story isn't just about them. It's about the terrifying truth uncovered by psychologists, that under the right conditions, anyone can cross the line between good and evil. Even you. This is the true story of how a system, a war, and a uniform turned victims into executioners and revealed the monster we all carry inside. What if I told you that under the right circumstances, you could become a monster too? That's the question that haunts anyone who has seen the images from Abu Ghraib prison. Grainy photographs, like something out of a nightmare, showed naked Iraqi prisoners, chained, stacked like objects, being humiliated, tortured, and in some cases, killed. But the most shocking part wasn't the brutality itself, it was who committed it. American soldiers, ordinary people, young men and women who days before might have been found at malls, college parties, or churches. What turned these people into something so cruel? This is the essence of the so-called Lucifer Effect, a concept coined by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, famous for his Stanford prison experiment. He argues that it's not just an inner monster that defines a person's capacity for evil, but the environment, the context, and systems of power that shape behavior. In the case of Abu Ghraib, hell was crafted by political decisions, the chaos of war, and a command chain that became conveniently invisible. Abu Ghraib, located west of Baghdad, was already a symbol of horror under Saddam Hussein's regime. When the United States took control, promising liberation and justice, no one imagined the place would once again become a laboratory of human suffering. The 372nd Military Police Company was assigned to oversee the prison. These soldiers weren't trained for interrogations or psychological warfare. Most were reservists, with little experience and completely unprepared. Among them were names that would go down in infamy: Lindy England, Charles Grainer, Sabrina Harmon. Faces that in the images appear smiling, pointing at humiliated prisoners as if they were in some macabre amusement park. But what led these young soldiers to become agents of brutality? The first weeks at Abu Ghraib were marked by confusion and disorganization. Prisoners arrived with no documentation, no clear accusations. They were held for days, sometimes weeks, in overcrowded cells, exposed to intense heat, constant screaming, and an environment where laws seemed to evaporate. The chain of command was broken. Higher-ranking officers were often absent or deliberately silent about what was happening in the holding blocks. That void of authority was filled by a twisted logic: do whatever it takes to get information. The war on terror demanded results. The price? The souls of young soldiers. Charles Grainer, a former civilian prison guard, took informal command of the torture sessions. He brought not only prison experience, but a distorted view of power. To him, prisoners were no longer human. They were enemies, vermin, targets. Lindy England, just 21 years old, was pulled into this vortex. In later testimonies, she claimed she was just following orders and wanted to please Grainer. The desire for belonging, acceptance, and approval, such deeply human psychological needs, were distorted and channeled into justifying horror. This is where the Lucifer Effect becomes clear. Ordinary people, immersed in a dehumanizing environment, without supervision, encouraged to use violence, begin to adopt behaviors they never imagined in peacetime. The system, as Zimbardo puts it, creates monsters and then feigns shock when they appear. Humiliations escalated into physical and psychological torture. Prisoners were kept naked for days, forced into sexual positions, threatened with dogs, beaten. Many had never been judged or formally accused of crimes. What was being punished wasn't guilt, it was otherness. They were punished for being different. What happens when a group is convinced that the other is inferior, dangerous, or subhuman? The answer is simple: they lose moral filters. And here we encounter one of the most dangerous mechanisms of the human psyche: dehumanization. Zimbardo demonstrated this in the Stanford experiment, where university students acting as guards began abusing peers playing the role of prisoners. In a matter of days, things spiraled out of control. At Abu Ghraib, the scenario was far worse. A real war, real deaths, and global consequences. Soldiers began referring to prisoners as animals, worms, insurgents. Language is the first step toward dehumanization. Then comes the physical treatment, isolation, forced nudity, silence. All of it strips away identity and makes violence easier. This psychology of power thrives in anonymity and lack of consequences. Soldiers knew their actions wouldn't be punished, at least not immediately. Superiors looked away, and in many cases encouraged it. Without moral boundaries or accountability, ordinary people began to exhibit extraordinary cruelty. Prisoners lost names and humanity. One soldier later admitted that after a few weeks, he no longer saw inmates as people, but as trash that needed to be taken out. This is systemic evil in its purest form, not driven by sadistic individuals, but enabled by oppressive environments, complicit authority, and the erasure of the enemy's humanity. Perhaps even more disturbing was the role of photography. Soldiers took pictures as trophies, reinforcing the illusion of absolute power. One of the most infamous, Lindy England smiling while holding a leash attached to a naked prisoner's neck. The war was no longer just physical. It was psychological, symbolic, and deeply perverse. What led these soldiers to participate? The answer lies not only in obedience, but in the dissolution of personal responsibility. Each believed they were just following orders, and that's one of the most dangerous justifications in human history. Psychologist Stanley Milgram showed in the 1960s that ordinary people could inflict pain on others simply under the command of authority. Participants in his experiment believed they were administering electric shocks to others, even when hearing screams, simply because an authoritative figure told them to continue. At Abu Ghraib, there wasn't a visible figure giving clear commands, but there was implied pressure. Break the prisoners, get results, serve the mission. This created what Zimbardo called a moral gray zone, where no one knows where the line is, and so it's constantly crossed. The group operated as a psychological bubble. When everyone around you is acting violently, it becomes the new normal. It's the group effect, the pressure to conform. And the more you participate, the harder it is to stop. It becomes a cycle of moral rationalization. If everyone's doing it, it must be okay. At Abu Ghraib, the environment was designed to erase individual identity. No soldier saw themselves as a person anymore. They were a part of the machine. And when the individual disappears, monsters emerge. Everything began to unravel when the photos were leaked to the media. The world reacted with horror and outrage. The images spread like wildfire online, made headlines globally, and the United States' reputation was deeply shaken. Suddenly, these soldiers were viewed as symbols of evil, of hypocrisy and barbarism. But here's the uncomfortable question. Were they the only ones to blame? The U.S. government quickly distanced itself. High-ranking officers claimed ignorance, and responsibility was dumped onto the lowest ranks. Charles Grainer was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Lindy England received 3 years. Other soldiers got lesser sentences, but the system that allowed it all to happen remained largely untouched. As in many historical episodes, the pawns were sacrificed to protect the architects of the game. Zimbardo, who testified for the defense, argued that individual punishment doesn't solve the real issue, a system that transforms ordinary people into executioners, that normalizes abuse, and erases the boundaries between right and wrong. The Abu Ghraib case wasn't a deviation. It was a symptom, a reflection of what happens when power becomes absolute, when the other is dehumanized, and when context molds morality. The most disturbing part of the Lucifer Effect isn't what it reveals about the soldiers at Abu Ghraib. It's what it reveals about all of us. You may feel distant from those images. You may think, I would never do that. But the truth, as Zimbardo, Milgram, and many others have shown, is that we all have the seeds of good and evil within us. It all depends on the soil where those seeds grow. Given the right environment, the right pressure, the absence of limits, and the presence of authority, Anyone can cross the line. That's the hardest truth to accept. But also, the most important. Abu Ghraib is a dark mirror. And when we look into it, we shouldn't just judge, we should reflect on the structures around us, the voices we obey, and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. The moral of this story is not about guilt, it's about awareness. Because as long as we ignore the invisible forces shaping our behavior, we will continue creating new Abu Ghraibs, new victims, new perpetrators, and perhaps the next person holding the leash might look a lot like you.